What is up, guys? It's your buddy Blue Spooky here. I wanted to ask you guys a question before we start. Since pretty much all the videos are an hour and 30 minutes lately, do you want me to keep the Megamix name, or would you prefer I go back to doing so-and-so amount of stories, volume whatever? Let me know what you guys think, because I'm rather conflicted on it myself. Besides that though, if you guys end up enjoying this video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing any of those really helps the channel and the video to do well, and ensures I can keep making these for a long time to come. I do my best to make sure that every story in these videos has not been read by me before. However, because I've read so many stories, some may slip through the cracks sometimes. So please understand if that happens. It's hard to keep track of every single one when I've read like 10,000 of them over the 10 years I've been doing this. If you guys would like to support the channel further than you already do, please be sure to click the join button. It should be somewhere around the subscribe button. You can support the channel for an additional $2 at the lowest tier, and you get special emoticons next to your name when you comment, and that you can use when you comment as well. No content is locked behind the paywall, of course. It's just something additional you can do if you'd like to support the channel further than you already do. Just watching is a big help already. Anyway, without further ado, I will get right into the stories, and I hope you guys enjoy them. Have a great day. I recently remembered something pretty creepy that happened when I was 16 years old. It was during the summertime, so I would be home from school just about every day. I lived with my parents, and we had these next-door neighbors who had one kid. He was 7 years old, and I didn't really know him that well. He wasn't in my age range. However, I would see him outside from time to time, and me and my family were quite friendly with his. One day during that summer, I guess the kid's parents both had to go somewhere, so they came over the day before and asked if I would be willing to babysit for them. They said they would be gone for probably 6 hours, from the morning until sometime in the afternoon. Now, I've never babysat before, but they said they would give me $50, so that made it a more easy decision. I quickly said yes. The next day, my parents both left for their jobs, and I headed over next door. The kid's name was Jacob, and before his parents left, they gave me some basic instructions. Jacob was old enough that it shouldn't be too difficult to look after him. So, after his parents left, Jacob and I started playing video games together. For a 7-year-old, he was actually really good. We were having a lot of fun together. This continued for several hours, when all of a sudden it was interrupted by a knock at the front door. We paused the game, and I got up to go see who was there. Jacob followed me. When we made it near the entryway of the home, I saw there was a man outside. He was standing on the front step and had long hair, a bit of a beard as well. He was wearing a sweatshirt and sweatpants as if he was out on a casual jog or something. I had no idea who the guy was, but after seeing him, I asked if Jacob knew the man. Jacob said that he didn't know who it was either, but the man had come to their house several days prior. When I asked if they had answered the door for him, he said no. I was curious as to why the man was here. I told Jacob to go in the other room, and then I answered the door. When I opened it up, the man looked kind of surprised actually. After saying hello, he asked if he could come inside the house. He didn't give a reason why. Obviously, I said no. I then asked him why he even wanted to come in. The man said that he was there to do a free floor inspection. I told him no thanks, and slammed the door shut in his face. This guy was certainly suspicious to me. I waited until he left the property and made sure he didn't go over to my house next door. He walked to a car that was parked on the side of the road and jumped inside. When he did, I went back over to Jacob and continued playing video games with him. A short time later, maybe 10 or 15 minutes or so, we paused the game to go and make some food. When we got to the kitchen, I noticed out the front window, though, that the man had not actually left and driven away. He was actually still inside his vehicle, which was parked a bit further down the street. I went closer to the window, and Jacob followed and looked out as well. While we were looking out the window, Jacob then told me he had seen this man also sitting in his car and seemingly watching him several days earlier. He said he'd been playing outside during that time when he noticed a man watching him from his vehicle, so he went back inside because he was scared. When he told me this, it made me even more suspicious about the man. We continued to watch the man from the window, and soon enough he noticed us watching him. He drove off immediately. We were both just glad he was gone. I was really confused, though, as to what he was doing. For the rest of the time that I looked after Jacob that day, we did not notice the man returning at all. Things went fairly well. When his parents got back, we immediately told them about that guy. I then went back over to my home. Personally, I never noticed the man in the neighborhood after. I'm guessing and hoping that he did not return. That was all very suspicious, though. I'd been driving for hours on a rural highway, close to sunset, when suddenly my car broke down. My phone had no signal, and as far as I could tell, I was far out from any town nearby. My car had started sputtering down the road, and eventually died out completely. I was now on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. I tried restarting the engine a few times, but nothing happened. At this point, I was really tired and getting quite frustrated as well. I got out and popped the hood, but I wasn't much of a mechanic. I didn't really know what to look for. I could see that smoke was rising from the engine for some reason, but that was about it. I had no idea at all what was wrong here. I thought about just walking to the nearest town, but obviously I had no idea how far away it was. Just a bit earlier on the road, though, I had passed by a small path that led to a driveway. It was a few miles back. I hoped there might be a house or some sort of help down that driveway. I grabbed a flashlight from the trunk and started walking. The light from the setting sun quickly faded, and when I finally arrived at the small drive, it was dark out. When I got there, I reached a small old home. It was barely visible behind a bunch of trees. The house appeared very unkempt. There was peeling paint and broken windows. The yard was completely overgrown, and the whole place looked abandoned. I was a bit skeptical of this. Obviously, I was not sure if anybody even lived there any longer. I decided to go and try anyways, though. What else was I going to do? When I knocked on the front door, there was no answer at first, so I knocked again. That was when I noticed the door was sitting open just a crack, so I pushed it open and took a few careful steps inside to see if anybody was around. The inside was pitch black and smelled dank and musty. The only light coming in was from an old flickering lamp on a table. I was thinking that this was really weird, but I was desperate for any help. I just hoped that somebody actually lived there. I heard a noise coming from the back of the home. It sounded like footsteps. I was nervous, but I called out, "Hello? Is anybody there? My car broke down and I was wondering if you could help me." There was no response. Whoever was walking around stopped immediately. I decided to leave due to the awkwardness of the situation and the fact that I was actually intruding a bit. I hadn't heard it happen, but somehow when I turned around, the door had shut behind me. When I went to leave, I tried to pull the handle, but I noticed it was locked as well. I started to panic. I noticed a small window near the ceiling, but it was too high for me to reach. I looked around for something to break the door open with, but I saw nothing useful near me. I didn't want to venture any further into the darkness of the home. As I was trying to find another way out, I heard a voice come from behind me. It was a low and raspy whisper. "What are you doing here?" I spun around, but there was nobody there that I could see. My heart was racing, and I felt like I was about to faint. I kept trying the door, hoping it would open, but it remained locked despite my efforts. I couldn't figure out how to unlock it either. It was like it was locked down from the other side. Suddenly, I heard footsteps again, but they were right behind me. I turned around slowly, and this time I saw a figure standing there in the shadows. It was hard to make out any details, but it looked just like a person. The figure moved closer, and I could see it was a man with his face obscured by some sort of hood. I backed away, but he didn't seem to be in a hurry. He just stared at me. The silence was deafening. I tried to reason with the man, saying I was sorry and I just needed help with my car. Once again, no response from the guy. He just stood there. I realized that I had to do something before he came any closer. I grabbed a heavy vase from a small table nearby and threw it at the figure, hoping to distract him. The vase shattered, and the figure hesitated for a moment before moving toward me. In a burst of adrenaline, somehow I managed to break the door open. I bolted outside, running through the overgrown yard and not stopping until I reached the road. My car was still right where I'd left it, but it was getting darker and I felt alone. I went back to where my car had broken down, hoping to flag down any passing car. I sat in my vehicle with the doors locked for almost 3 hours, waiting for anyone to drive by on this lonely rural highway. Thankfully, the man inside the house did not appear to follow me out to my vehicle. When I finally saw the headlights of another car coming down the road, I got out the flashlight and flagged them down. The driver was a nice man who offered to drive me to the next town. He dropped me off with no incident, and I finally had service there to call a tow truck and put an end to my terrible night. I realized the cabin was very sketchy, and it wasn't the greatest idea to enter it uninvited, but I was panicking about my broken-down vehicle and trying to get help before it got super dark. I hope that I never have to go through anything like that again. I lived in this poor area in southern rural Ohio for a period of time when I was younger. I think, if I recall correctly, that I was around 13 at the time. There weren't a lot of houses in the area, and the ones that were there were situated in different places on a series of hills. One thing I always thought was very neat was how the houses were on hills facing each other, and you could see them, but they were very far away. While we were there, I was very interested in astronomy. For my birthday, I got this really small telescope. It wasn't that powerful, and you couldn't really see anything much better in the sky than you could normally, but I still enjoyed the experience. When I started to get a bit bored, though, I learned I could do something a little more with this telescope of mine. I could spy on people on the side of the hill that we were facing. It was sort of a rear window thing, long before I even knew what a rear window even was. During the summer of that year, I spent way too much time doing this. My other siblings were more of the outdoors type than I was, so they were usually off with their buds doing things outside. I was always the one who had problems making friends. That didn't really bother me, though. I actually preferred to stay in my room and do things on my own. I should probably mention before I go on that I wouldn't do something like this nowadays. This was in the early 90s, and I was a kid that didn't really think about how intrusive, creepy, and weird this sort of thing would be. One day, I was sitting at my desk using the telescope to look around at my neighbors on the other side of the hill. I was pretty surprised, though, when I looked at one house and saw my older brother and one of his friends walking up to it. I didn't know the friend that well, so I assumed the house they were walking up to must be the friend's home. They didn't walk up to the door and go in, though. Instead, after looking around for a while, they went to the side of the home and went around to the back. At that point, I couldn't see them anymore, even though they were out of view. I wondered what they were up to. I kept watching the house to see when they would emerge. It took a while, but I was so curious to see what was happening that I didn't stop watching. For a few moments, nothing happened, but then something very odd did. My brother's friend walked out the front door, looked around a bit, saw an aluminum bat on the porch, and grabbed it and walked back inside. I was shocked by what I was seeing. I mean, even seeing him come out the front door made me think he must have broken in through the back. I had no idea why he would have needed that baseball bat. I kept watching out of my telescope, knowing that from how far apart all the houses on that hill were, I was likely the only one seeing this, and I had no idea what to do about it. After a while, my brother and his friend emerged, carrying some items including the baseball bat. I watched and they went and threw the bat down the side of the hill. Then they got into a truck that was in the driveway and drove off together. I went out to my parents and told them what I'd just seen. They didn't really believe me, but I insisted that I really had seen it. Even though it took a while, my dad said he wouldn't call the police, but I convinced him to go to the house to see what was going on. I showed him the correct one through the telescope, and he took off. I watched as my dad went over. He came out after a short time and stood on the porch for a while. I didn't know what he was up to, but I watched him stand there as if he were waiting for someone. It turns out he was waiting for the police, who arrived soon after. I saw them talking to him, and right then I heard the door to the house open. I heard my brother's voice talking to someone. They came and went into his bedroom. I stayed quiet and listened to them until they eventually left the house again. My brother and his friend were soon arrested. The house they broke into belonged to a guy they regularly bought weed from. They'd met up and something, I don't know what, went wrong in their transaction. My brother and his friend beat the guy down and robbed him. The guy did live, but he was severely affected by the damage. My brother and his friend didn't actually get into as much trouble as you might think, likely because of their ages. They were on probation for a while. What scared me the most, though, is wondering what my brother would have done to me if he had walked by my room and seen me looking over in the direction of that house through my telescope. I spent a bit of time when I was younger being homeless in a rural town. You couldn't find anywhere to sleep within the town itself because the police would always give you a hard time. Although I could wander around during the day, I had to find somewhere else to go during the night. That wasn't really a big deal, however, as there were plenty of hills and forests just outside of town. I had picked an old tent out of someone's garbage once, so I set it up in the woods just outside of the city. It was a decent protection against the winds and rains, but of course during the winter it was nothing against the cold. I did have some blankets to help out with that though. I lived in an area that was hot or warm for most of the year, but the couple of months it could get really cold, those were always the hardest times being homeless. Occasionally, there would be someone else who was homeless too, and we would camp out together. I was always nice to them, knowing they were in the same situation that I was. The tent could definitely hold 2 people, and those people would come and go. When this happened, I was all by myself. It was a very cold night, and I could tell it was going to be especially harsh. It was one of those times when you realize immediately there's a snowstorm on the way. I'm sure you know what I mean. This was one of those times. It was during the day and I could just see it in the clouds. Also, in the town I was in, there was a tendency for everyone to crowd the stores when a storm was coming in order to grab up as many supplies as they could. As I spent that day in town, I could see that was very clearly happening. I had a little bit of money myself, so I got a few things to take back to my tent with me. I got some food from the Dollar Tree that I hoped would last me a few days, just in case it was difficult to get around during the storm. It was already snowing by the time I had everything, and quite a bit before I made it back to my tent. The storm wasn't just snow though. It got really cold out there that night, and the wind was bad too. My tent was being battered by the wind. I was praying my hardest that the frail thing would be able to survive the storm. The strong gusts of wind were blowing everything around, and it was so loud, it was the only sound I could hear practically. Unfortunately for me, I've always found the sound of wind to be very comforting, so it helped to relax me a little bit. I had a flashlight I would use when I needed, but I didn't want to waste the battery. I got myself all bundled up in my blankets in the dark and tried my best to listen to the storm. Because of the darkness and the storm's noises, even though I was pretty cold, I was able to drift off to sleep at some point. When I suddenly woke up, I wasn't exactly sure what had made me wake up at first. It was still sometime during the night, and the storm was still raging on outside, just like it had been when I'd initially fallen asleep. I let my eyes adjust upon waking up, and what I saw definitely shocked me. The front flap of my tent had been opened, and I saw a dark figure emerging slowly into it. It was a big black shadow, and I couldn't make out who it was. Before I could even do anything, the figure grasped my leg. I tried kicking at it out of instinct, but it didn't let go. It began to pull me outside. Whatever it was had a hold on only one of my legs, so I kept trying to kick it with the other, hoping it would let go of me. They just kept swatting at my leg while I was kicking, and still trying to pull me outside. Frantically, I tried grabbing for something, and I did get what I was looking for. When I was halfway pulled out of the tent, I managed to grab the knife I kept for protection, and stabbed several times at the arm that was yanking me outside. I actually got him at least 3 times before he finally let go. When he did, I immediately pulled myself back inside the tent, getting snow all over the place. I pulled back against the back of the tent as far from the entrance as possible. It took a few moments, but the figure tried to come back and grab me again. When it did, I lunged out, stabbing it twice in the shoulder, before it finally retreated. At that point, I zipped up the tent again, and once again pulled myself to the back, which I forgot to mention was against a tree. I gathered my blankets around me, and held my knife out at the ready, prepared to slash again if the figure tried anything. I waited and waited. Each moment was nerve-wracking, as I kept expecting something to happen. Nothing did, however. The stabbing seemed to have scared him away. I assumed it was another homeless man who wanted to use my tent as shelter from the storm. But later, when I came across another homeless guy in the area, I didn't find anyone who had suffered any knife wounds. I never did find out who the man was. Several college friends of mine decided to go on a camping trip after we had completed our finals. We went to an area that was well known for its campgrounds. You could hike out and find many different camping areas, and although it was fairly popular, you could easily find a way to not come into contact with any other campers. We rented out a certain spot on the map that had a nice circle for us to put all our tents up in and around the fire area. We were planning on staying out there for a whole week. None of us had been camping very often, so we were bound to do some really stupid things while out there. But it was nice being out there in the countryside like we were. We had never been out like that before, that far away from society, and I found myself really enjoying it actually. After about 3 days there, we had cooked some late dinner and sat around the fire, drinking and telling stories to each other. I went to bed a lot earlier than everyone else did. I couldn't hold my beers as easily as they did, so I retired early and fell asleep rather quickly. I was woken up sometime later by what sounded like a scream coming from right outside my tent. I had no idea how long I'd been asleep for, but that woke me right up. I decided I needed to go outside and see what was going on. I guess 2 of our friends had stayed up later than everyone else, a girl and a guy. The girl kept saying that she'd seen some guy standing out in the woods watching her. The guy she'd been up with hadn't seen anything and was doing whatever he could to try and get her to calm down. It was very odd. Two of the guys went out to look and see if there was indeed anyone out there. I stayed and tried to help my friend calm down. Before the two guys could come back, though, I suddenly heard her scream again and begin pointing out into the trees. When I looked out there, I saw at least 3 figures standing in the woods, hiding behind various trees and shrubbery. They looked like they were wearing dark clothes and some sort of masks on their faces as well. They weren't all standing together, mind you, but at different spots outside the circle of tents. It only took a moment after I'd spotted them that they turned around and ran off into the woods. Soon after, the two guys came back. They had seen the figures running and even tried chasing them down for a moment, but it was difficult to keep up in the dark of night. They eventually had to give up and come back. What was scariest of all was not just how they were dressed, but how they behaved as well. They seemed to be watching us for quite a while, but we had no idea why. If they ran when my friend screamed at them and I saw them, though, that could only make us think they were up to no good. You know, they were up to something they could only get away with if they remained in the dark and undetected. The rest of the night was very hard to sleep, and someone had to keep watch at all times. Nothing happened. The following day, the two guys went to report it to the people running the campground. We actually did end up staying for the rest of the time, but it was scary each night, expecting those guys to return. We also had no way to identify them, and no way of knowing what they were up to. My parents got divorced when I was really young. My sister and I ended up living with our mom because our dad wanted to go off on his own with tons of women, getting drunk all the time. My mom had to take whatever job she could, often leaving us with our grandparents when we were really young. However, we also ended up moving from place to place quite a bit, and there were times when it wasn't feasible to get us to our grandparents' house. As we got older, because of this, there would be times when we had to spend our time at home by ourselves. The places that my mom would get for us to live in were normally out of town, out in the country sort of places. They were much cheaper than living in the city. We lived in a few different hollers, thinking back on those sorts of times. Many of the early places didn't even have inside bathrooms. Of course, by the time I was 10 and my sister was 8, we did have homes with bathrooms in them. A lot of the places we didn't stay very long in, but there was one house that we were in for at least a couple of years. My mom was able to hold down a decent job for all of that time, so we didn't have any problems that would force us to move. Of course, we also didn't have anyone who could babysit us there, so we always spent the time at home by ourselves. The school bus let us off one fall day, and we walked down the road to the house. There were some other houses and kids in the area, but none that we knew very well. They were also only boys, so my mom didn't want us playing or interacting with them by ourselves. We only talked to them a little bit as we walked home from the bus. Our mom was always late on these nights. She was a waitress at a bar, and there were always a lot of people getting drunk at bars, so she would have to deal with them for a while. As usual, the two of us just remained in and had to take care of ourselves. It was getting dark on this night, and we were listening to the radio. We didn't have a TV back then. That was when my sister thought she had heard something. She told me she heard some noises coming from by the kitchen, which was the back of the house. I was 13 years old at the time, so I was still a bit frightened by these sorts of things. Still, I decided I had to go and see if there really was anything in there. I turned on the kitchen light in time to see that there were two boys at the back kitchen door. I could see them through the window, trying to break into the house. They managed to get the door open right as I'd come inside the kitchen. I only had a few moments to turn around and run, and get my sister to run with me into our bedroom. We did so, and locked the door behind us. We hid under the bed, listening to what was going on in the house. It sounded like the boys were knocking things over, and more than a few things were breaking. I couldn't tell what they were doing exactly, but it seemed like they were looking for something in particular. We were sure at one point we heard them go into our mom's room, which really scared me, because I knew that's where she kept her gun. It took a while, but soon enough they came over to our bedroom door and tried to open it. When they found they couldn't, they began taunting us and telling us to open the door right now. They tried pounding on the door and yelling at us, threatening us by telling us all sorts of terrifying things they were going to do to us. Fortunately, these boys were not very big and weren't strong enough to break down the bedroom door, which was much more solid than the kitchen door. The two of us were terrified and kept expecting the boys to make it through at any moment. Eventually, they gave up. I kept expecting to hear them shooting off my mom's gun or something, but nothing like that did happen. There were more noises going on outside, but the two of us couldn't do anything. Eventually, when it got quiet, we didn't leave the room. We hid under the bed instead, for hours until my mom eventually got home. The boys likely knew that she was out every evening, and that's why they chose when they did to break in. I'm not sure what happened to the boys or if anything did. We had to spend a lot of time home by ourselves even when we moved again, and it was terrifying. To this day, that break-in really scares me when I'm by myself. I'm a woman, and I work at a clothing store in a mall. This is something that happened over the summer. I started work at 12 p.m. and was working a closing shift. The mall is open until 9 o'clock. But our store closed at 8 on that particular day. It was a Saturday, so the mall was really busy. We got a lot of customers throughout the store, and I was busy basically the entire shift. When things started to get interesting, though, was at about 4 p.m. or so. I remembered that I was working at one of the 4 registers we had, ringing up all the various customers. A woman who I was helping told me that she wanted to let me know there was a man in the store that was acting incredibly suspiciously. I told the woman thank you for letting us know, and when I was done helping her, I notified another employee. I wasn't exactly sure what she meant by suspiciously, but I knew it couldn't be good. The description of the man was a white man with a green sweatshirt and jeans, average height. I glanced around the store, but I couldn't see all the areas from where I was. Plus, the many racks and displays of clothing that we had everywhere didn't allow me to see all the customers well. Still, I didn't catch any signs of such a man. Not even 5 minutes later, though, I got another complaint from a different woman who said that a guy in a green sweatshirt was following her all around the store. When I was done helping her, I decided to go find this guy myself and ask him what he thought he was doing. I left the counter and started walking around the store. Eventually, I did discover him in the back corner. He made eye contact with me for a brief moment before looking away as soon as he saw me walking toward him. After that, he turned around and began moving quickly toward the exit. Then he left. I figured he must have gotten the message without me having to say anything directly. He must have known he was doing something wrong and was going to get kicked out soon. I was just glad he was gone. Hopefully no more of our customers would be bothered by the man. For the rest of my shift, everything went pretty great. Things quieted down significantly after 7 p.m., and it was very calm for the final hour of work before getting off. There were 3 of us employees working, and at 8 o'clock the other 2 went home. I stayed back to finish up a few things, though. We closed the store by sliding the metal barrier from both sides. My last job of the day was to go around and make sure everything was relatively in order. It would usually only take me about 10 or 15 minutes. I would go sweep the floors, pick up garbage, and if any items were out of place or looking sloppy, I would fix them up a bit. Things were taking a little bit longer than usual because it had been such a busy Saturday. There were more things messed up than there usually were. I started in the front and made my way to the back. When I was almost done and at the very back of the store, I was looking through one of the clothing racks. For some reason, I instinctively looked up across at the other end. I was looking at the other back corner of the store. I immediately noticed something was wrong. There was a man hiding behind a clothing display inside another rack of clothes. He was peeking out, and I could just barely tell he was wearing something green. I realized it must have been the exact same man that had been here before. In that moment, thankfully he wasn't looking directly at me. My heart started racing, but I tried my best to act normal. The corner of the store that he was in was the only section I had not cleaned or organized yet, and I had been going to do it next. I sure wasn't going to do it anymore, though. After I finished organizing the rack of clothes that I was in, I casually walked over to the front end of the store. When I got there, I stopped and texted the mall security number. I hoped they would have a swift response time. I felt like I shouldn't leave the store because I was the only employee there, but I wanted to stay right by the front, as far away from that guy as possible. Soon, though, I heard a noise coming from the back of the store. As soon as I did, I ran to the gate and opened it, sliding it open just enough for me to get out, then pushing it down shut behind me. When I did, I just barely saw the man coming into view. I walked to the business next door and saw a security guard walking toward me from down the hallway. I waved him over, and at that same time saw out of the corner of my eye behind me the man leaving the store I worked at. I pointed at him, and the security guard had to chase the guy down. He did end up catching the man, and I had to make a report as well. I was just happy to be okay, though. Looking back, I'm glad I noticed the man when I did, because it's really creepy to think about how he was in there the entire time alone with me while I was working, and I never once noticed him before then. This happened back when I was in college. It was just after my freshman year had ended. I was driving back home for the summer, which was pretty far away. The school that I went to was about a 10-hour drive from home. I hoped to make it home in one single day, but things did not go as smoothly as I would have liked them to. Originally, I was going to leave the day after my final exams from my dorm room. I didn't have too much stuff to bring with me and could fit it all in my car very easily. However, my exams finished a little bit earlier than I expected. I had the thought to leave right then and there. I didn't really like my roommate that much, so I thought the sooner I left, the better. I left that day instead of waiting until the next. The drive was really long, but mostly entirely on freeways. By the time it was 10 o'clock at night, I found myself with still 3 more hours to drive. And that's when I started getting extremely sleepy. The more I drove, the harder it was to stay awake. I knew I wouldn't be able to make it home that night and would need to stop and rest. At that time, I did not have enough money for a hotel room. I technically did have enough, but I didn't want to spend it. Being a college student, I didn't have much money. I also hadn't started my summer job yet. I figured it wouldn't be a big deal if I just slept for a couple of hours in my vehicle. I'm not very big, and I could almost stretch out in the back. I put into my phone a search for a rest area. I was hoping there would be a place coming up soon that I could stop at, and thankfully there was one just a mile up the road. I did my best to stay awake until then. I opened my windows, turned my radio all the way up, and drank some water as well. None of that really seemed to help me much, though. Fortunately, I was able to make it to the rest area. When I pulled in, it wasn't quite what I was hoping for. I was hoping to see a large rest area with a decent-sized building and gas station, something with a lot of other people around. What I saw instead was a very quiet and small rest area with just a single little building, probably just bathrooms and a couple vending machines. There were only about 3 other cars parked along the long lane of parking spaces. I drove down to the far end and parked my own car. I was facing a small grassy area. Beyond that was surrounded by woods. This area was kind of creepy to me, but I was far too tired to really care all that much. Most of my things were in the trunk or my front passenger seat, but I did have a few bags of clothes in the back seat. I took a couple of pieces of clothing and covered the windows, but I was unable to cover the front window. Instead, I took a blanket and created a wall by hanging it over the seats. By the time I was done doing all that, I laid down and fell asleep almost immediately. My original plan had been to sleep for just a few hours. I didn't set an alarm or anything, but sleeping in the car, I figured I wouldn't be asleep for very long. I remember that when I woke up, it was still dark out. I didn't know exactly what time it was. I looked at my phone and saw that it was 1 a.m. Things were completely silent, but the silence was quickly interrupted by a noise. It sounded like footsteps that were very close by. I leaned over to the window my head was closest to, which was the back seat driver's side. When I looked down, I didn't see anything. I heard the footsteps continuing. They sounded like they were on the other side of my vehicle. I moved over to look out of that side. As I looked out, I saw there was only one other car in the parking lot in the rest stop now. It was at the complete other end, and I didn't see anybody else. It was very strange. I saw from behind the blanket I had put up that somebody was walking by the front end of my car now. My heart started racing. There wasn't really a reason why somebody should be walking around my car in a circle this way, especially when they were parked at the other end of the rest stop. I closed my eyes and was completely still. Then there was a knock at my driver's window. I almost jumped up, but I didn't. I stayed there and was silent. All I wanted was whoever this was to go away. After they knocked, things were completely silent for a few seconds. Then whoever was there tried opening the driver's side door. When they found it was locked, they went over and tried my rear driver's side. I had my keys next to me in the back, and I was now wide awake at this point. I realized that I should probably drive away, but in going to the front seat, whoever was there would surely see me for sure. Then there was a loud bang on my window, right by my head. I tore down the blanket dividing the back seat and the front, and hopped into the driver's seat of the car. I tried not to look out of the window, but I saw a man jump right in front of it. I didn't get a good look at him, but he was right next to my car. It was terrifying. I started up the engine, and as soon as my car was running, I slapped it into reverse and backed up out of there. As I did, the man ran alongside me. I put the car into drive and sped away, back to the road. The man was unable to follow me. I drove all the way home after that, only stopping to get gas. I was wide awake the entire time after my experience. I ended up getting home at 5 o'clock in the morning, which was a really odd time to arrive back. I was able to get some more sleep after that, though. Not really sure who that guy was, messing around with my vehicle, or what he wanted. I'm really glad I don't have to find out, though. One day, I was in school for a seemingly average Thursday. I was a senior in high school, and in my third-hour history class. This was one of my favorite classes because the teacher was really cool. For this story, I'll just call him Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith was very laid back and would give us a lot of time to do homework in class. We would rarely have any actual homework because we could easily get it all done before we even left for the day. He would teach for the beginning, and then at the end of the class, it would pretty much be like study hall. We could talk, get work done. He would even let us go on our phones and listen to music as we did our work. On this day, it was a normal class period. I often had my headphones in as I studied, and I did on this day as well. We were working on our assignment, and I got done a bit early. I would joke around with Mr. Smith sometimes, as did some of the other students. I remembered that I went up to him to turn in my assignment, and he asked me if I could do him a favor real quick. He said he had to give back some iPads to another teacher. We had used them the previous day for a group assignment thing. There were about 10 iPads in this carrying case. I was happy to do this because it was something to do to get out of class. He wrote me a pass and I grabbed the iPad case. It was supposed to go to a teacher's classroom that was a little ways away. I left the classroom with my headphones still in and unpaused my music. I then started walking through the empty hallways to the other classroom. At this point, there was about 15 minutes left of class. Soon enough, I reached the room I was supposed to go to. I tried opening the door, but I found it was locked. I could see in the window as well that all the lights were off. I found this a bit odd, but quickly figured that the teacher must not be there. She probably just didn't teach a class during this hour or something. I turned around and started to head back to my own classroom. I had walked about halfway back when I saw something up ahead. There was a spot where 2 hallways intersected a ways up, and I saw a man up ahead who I didn't recognize at all. The man was clearly not a teacher or a student, and I didn't think he worked at the school either. It struck me as suspicious immediately. I only saw him for a second or two, because he passed by one hallway and into the other. The man hadn't looked in my direction at all. The problem was that he was walking in the direction my classroom was in. I kept walking up ahead. When I got to where the man had walked past, I stopped and looked down the hallway first. When I did, I saw the man again. He was a long ways down, near the area where my classroom was. It appeared the man was looking for something in particular. I didn't want to go down there, obviously. I started walking in the opposite direction. I took out my headphones at that point. Everything was silent. I didn't really know where I was going anymore. I was trying to figure out what exactly was going on here. After walking around the empty hallways for 5 minutes, I thought maybe the man would be gone by then. I started heading back for my class area. When I got back to that hallway where I had last seen him, the man appeared to be gone. I was just glad to see this. I started moving down the hallway, but just a few steps later, I heard footsteps coming from behind me. They were moving toward me at a rapid pace. There were some bathrooms right there, so I ducked inside. I didn't know who the person was, but I really didn't want them to see me. By now, I had very easily figured out they were not supposed to be in the school. After going inside the bathroom, at first I just waited there. When the footsteps began to get closer, I moved into one of the stalls. The man passed by and did not go inside. I waited a little while longer before looking out of the bathroom. When I did, I saw the person was down the hallway once again near where my class was. I left the bathroom and quickly tried to walk to the other hallway away from this guy. I must have been louder this time though, because when I did, I heard movement behind me. I saw the guy look right at me. Immediately, he turned and started moving in my direction. The guy was really far behind me, at least over 100 feet away. I moved as quickly as possible and down another hallway. By this point, I wanted to get out of the school entirely, or far enough away from the guy that he couldn't find me anymore. I moved down the hallway for a while and took a left to another one. I was going to the stairs to go down to the first floor. As I approached the stairs, I heard somebody coming up them. I stopped. I didn't know who this person could be. When they came into view, I saw they were a police officer. They asked me what I was doing, and I asked him what was going on. He told me the school was on lockdown, and they were searching for a man who was not supposed to be there. I pointed the officer in the direction I'd last seen him and went downstairs, where several more officers were waiting. I showed them my student ID, and we found a nearby classroom. They had me wait inside there until the lockdown was over. It lasted about 15 more minutes. Then it ended. We were let out, and by then it was time for the next class period. I'm not sure who that guy was, or what he was looking for. I also don't know how he got into our school either. I hadn't been able to hear that we were going into lockdown because my headphones were in and I couldn't hear anything. Looking back, if I would have known, I would have tried to go into any classroom. I don't know what would have happened to me if the man had caught up with me, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out. I was off work this night and relaxing at home. My roommate was out of town for a couple of days, visiting his parents. I was somewhat of a night owl anyway, so I enjoyed staying up late. It was around 12 o'clock and I was sipping on a beer while watching some TV when a faint sound came from above me. At first, I didn't even process it, like my body had just ignored it. After a few seconds, though, it kind of hit me all at once. I realized it could not possibly have been my roommate, like it usually would have been. I looked up at the ceiling and muted the TV to try and listen. A few seconds went by, and there was nothing. The sound had been so soft, and with the TV being on when I heard it, I really had no idea what it could have been, or even where upstairs it was coming from. Although this sounds pretty dumb of me, I really didn't feel like getting up, and wasn't worried enough about it to feel the need to check it out myself. I opened up the mini fridge I had next to the couch and grabbed another beer, cracking it open and taking a few sips to get back to relaxing. Before I could even unmute the TV, though, I heard that same thumping sound from above. I looked back up at the ceiling, and after a moment I could hear subtle footsteps slowly walking in the room right above me. My whole body felt like it went numb. I got up from the couch and went over to the stairs. I stood at the bottom of them and could hear a thumping sound resonating throughout the hallway. I called out my roommate's name. I knew it couldn't be him, but I was just hoping somehow it was. After there was no reply, I started scaling the stairs and flicked on the lights to the upstairs hallway. It was empty, but the door at the far end was now open. That was my roommate's room. I was 100% certain I'd closed it the day he left, and I never went in there, since there would be no reason to. Now it was currently open. My heart was pounding as I walked through the hallway and looked inside the room. It looked the same as it did when he'd left. Everything was clean and nothing was out of place at all. I went around and checked every room upstairs and still found nothing. I couldn't sleep that night and spent the next few days on edge as I waited for my roommate to get home. I never heard those sounds after that night or had any doors randomly open like that again. At this point, I don't know what the hell happened. Maybe someone found a way in and out without me knowing, or maybe it was something else entirely. To this day, I still don't know. I was born and raised in Alaska, Anchorage more specifically, and had decided to start my undergrad studies in a small college town in Montana. Anyway, due to many financial pitfalls, my family and I decided that me moving back home and going to school more locally would be the best bet. The academic year wrapped up, and my mom flew down to meet me for a road trip through Canada before re-entering the U.S. on the Alaskan side. Of course, because I had intended to live in Montana for 4 years, there was a lot of junk in my car weighing it down. I wasn't keen on speeding through unfamiliar roadways. The first day or so was great. My mom and I stopped here and there to do some shopping in a few larger Canadian cities. Overall, we made a point of traveling mostly during the daylight hours, but during the early morning and evenings, I usually drove. My mom had eye surgery a year or so before, so her eyesight tends to not be so great at night. On the third night, I was driving us to a hotel. Things were going fine, but we were a bit behind schedule. It was getting dark faster than I would have liked. Somewhere after Stork Crossing, we ended up with this complete jerk tailgating us with his high beams on. I was kind of annoyed, because I was already going nearly 10 kilometers over the speed limit. I moved to the side and waited for the guy to go around me. I would like to point out that this was a single-lane, two-way road with nearly no traffic. Despite me getting out of the way and waiting for this guy to go around, they seemed to mimic my movements, staying right behind me even as I moved almost off the road. By now, I began feeling this heavy, cold feeling in the pit of my gut. My mom began panicking. As I said before, the woman's as blind as a bat in the dark, and I was having a fairly hard time making out anything in my mirrors, with this idiot's high beams blinding me. Unfortunately, I could not get the make and model of the vehicle, let alone a license plate number or anything about the driver. This all continued on for a while. I dropped down to the speed limit, sort of putting my foot down and saying that if he wanted to speed, he had to go around me. The tailgating and high beaming still continued, even as other people passed by and flashed their high beams at this guy. We were maybe 10 or so kilometers outside of Arlington when things really escalated. As we were now getting closer to civilization, my mom told me to just speed up and lose them. The driver suddenly sped up as well, as if sensing I was now actively fleeing. At this point, they started to attempt to ram us from the rear driver's side. It might have been sheer luck that they missed, or perhaps I simply accelerated faster than them. As all of this was happening, my mom was attempting to get a call through to emergency services. Neither of her phones had a signal. By now, I was easily breaking the speed limit by at least 20 kilometers per hour. When the engine behind revved up, the vehicle, a large SUV I now realized, zipped around us and suddenly slammed their brakes, with their vehicle now diagonal to us. I slammed on my brakes in response and nearly lost all control as I drove almost entirely off the road. In the passenger seat, my mom was screaming hysterically. I barely noticed, though. At the time, all I could make out was that in front of me, several figures were in the SUV. I remember seeing red before shifting into reverse and hitting the gas, shifting back into drive and speeding forward. I narrowly missed the back end of the SUV in the escape. After that, I wasn't entirely sure what happened. I was speeding off, and the vehicle was still following, but now much further back. As we pulled into Arlington, they disappeared down some random side street. My mom and I debated going to the police. We stopped at the first place with lights on, a hotel. My mom ran in to use the phone. I waited in the car, trembling from the rush and anxious in case that SUV was still prowling around. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just some idiot teenagers who didn't understand driving etiquette or how to drive around somebody. Maybe it was just some prank. I also considered that it might have been insurance-related, but they seemed more interested in forcing me off the road than making me hit them. In the end, there was nothing that could be done by the local police. So my mom and I just continued on, slightly paranoid now. When we finally got back, we agreed not to share this with Dan, because he was already controlling and paranoid enough as it is. I suppose his paranoia is not without reason, though, since if things had gone differently, I might not be here to share this story with you all. I've lived and worked here in Portland, Maine for a long time, and every spring we get almost biblical levels of rain. It's a huge pain in the butt, but it's something you just have to learn to live with after a while. You invest in a good umbrella and a waterproof coat, and just muddle on like a good Mainer does. Although, if some of you Californians saw the kind of weather we endure, you'd be more than likely to call us maniacs. As I said, for the most part the rain is nothing but a minor irritation, a price we pay for the magnificent falls that are enjoyed by leaf peepers from all over the country. As I found out one dark and rainy night, though, the climate in this area of the country can sometimes make it straight up dangerous to live there. So picture the scene. It was raining cats and dogs, practically. I was walking back to the apartment in an older part of town. It was fully dark out. One of the streets on my regular route has been around since the early 1800s. It's still lined with cobblestone, while the sidewalks are these big flat slate-like slabs that can get super slippery in the spring and fall. I'm pretty sure it's because of a kind of algae or moss that grows on them, making them very slimy. I'm not a biologist either way, so don't quote me on that though. All I'm saying is it can be like standing in an ice rink at certain times of the year. I'd already gotten an idea of how slippery it was as I was walking, but I got a text that I assumed was from my boss, hopefully regarding the raise I'd been probing for. The light on my phone must have thrown my vision off as I went to check, and in turn my footing, because one minute I was just walking along minding my own business, and next I was lying flat on the sidewalk with the wind knocked out of me. The first thought that registered through my brain was all sorts of expletives that I can't repeat here. As I tried to find my feet again, I couldn't do so. My left foot just didn't seem to do what I wanted it to do. When I went down to look, it was flopping around in a way that makes my stomach churn just thinking about it. Pain began to shoot through my leg, and in seconds it was like my entire body was racked with agony. Every time I moved, the shooting pain zapped up my calf and thigh. I began to realize I'd suffered either a serious break or some sort of other injury. Any other time I'd have called 911 then and there, but my phone had slipped out of my hands as I fell. When I looked around for it, it was nowhere to be seen. I started thinking it must have slipped off the sidewalk or something. As I was about to look, something else grabbed my attention. A sewer drain just off the sidewalk, one of those metal grid kinds, not a culvert. It hit me that my phone may have actually clattered down into the sewer as I fell. It was a horrendous stroke of misfortune, but I figured it couldn't be long until a passerby stumbled across me so I could get the help I needed. As I was looking around, getting increasingly pelted by the relentless New England deluge, I realized there was not a soul in the streets. You get accustomed to Maine rain, that's a given, but you still avoid going out in the worst of it. It occurred to me that if I actually wanted any help, I may have to call for it with all my might, or maybe even scream. I started screaming for help, that I'd fallen and could not get up any longer. I continued to scream, but no one responded. I could see lights on in windows of apartment buildings mere yards away, so I knew people must be able to hear me, but they chose to do nothing. I guess that's just how life is in big cities. These days, people are terrible, assume everything is fake or a scam or whatever. It is what it is. Anyway, a few minutes went by, and it became apparent that nobody was going to help me. If I wanted to actually make any progress in getting to the emergency room, I would have to drag myself along the wet sidewalk until I found someone compassionate enough to actually help me. Just before I was forced to undergo such indignity, though, I suddenly saw a silhouette of a person appear in a streetlight. I started calling out to my shadowy potential savior. You'd think if you saw a girl lying in the street calling out for help, with obvious pain in her voice, you'd at least change your pace to get over a little faster or something. But this guy noticed me, stopped for a moment as if to consider, and carried on walking over to me at the same speed, not acknowledging me at all. It was a weird feeling. That overwhelming sense of relief turned into absolute dread in just moments. The person approaching me was not exactly giving off helpful vibes like I expected. They were giving off quite the opposite. They didn't say anything in response as they continued to approach. I called out to them again. Sir, I think I've broken my ankle. Can you call 911 for me?" They just stayed completely silent. Seconds later, I was looking up at this guy, rain splashing my eyes. I could barely make out his facial features. "Well, what happened to you?" He seemed barely concerned at all. When I told him what the issue was, I spelled it out for this guy. He nodded his head and replied with a blank, It was frustrating, as it was unnerving. I told him all over again the backstory and begged him to call 911. Instead, he just towered over me, tilting his head like I was raising some kind of animal curiosity. I dropped my phone. Can you see it anywhere?" I remember asking that in the moment. He actually did start looking around for it, which made me momentarily feel a little better, that he might actually want to help me. In hindsight, I don't think he would have handed it over if he found it. His next move, one which I mistook for him trying to help me up, was him starting to pat me down for valuables. He went and grabbed my purse off me. I was stunned to silence as he rifled through its contents, helping himself to a few loose bills. I couldn't believe anyone could be so callous, even in a big city like this. I was disappointed, angry, and obviously still in pain. I wasn't outright scared, though, until the guy took out my photo ID I used for work. He stared at it for a moment, and then slipped it into his pocket and left everything else behind. That's when I realized he was not looking for monetary gain. He wasn't so much a thief or opportunist as an outright predator, and the thought of what he was going to do to me while I was lying here helpless completely terrified me. He didn't walk away with my ID. He just carried on standing over me, a grin of delight coming over his face at how helpless I was. He could do whatever he liked to me, and there wasn't a soul around to stop him. Me, a 30-year-old woman, started crying like a little girl. I begged him not to hurt me, to just leave with the money he'd taken. That only made him grin even further, but I was in no position to fight back. The best I could hope for was to hit him with his keys if he tried to take things further. Right then, as I was reaching for them lying there on the sidewalk, I heard one of the sweetest sounds I'd heard in my life. "Hey, excuse me, is everything all right there?" It was a guy's voice, polite but aggressive and accusatory. Someone had finally come out from one of the apartment buildings nearby. Instantly, the hooded guy began walking off, as chill as ever. "Hey, I'm talking to you!" The man just continued on his way. The guy who came out looked back at me, then went back inside, I'm guessing to get his wife and someone to call the police. He rushed out to ask if I was okay, which triggered an even bigger wave of ugly crying as I pointed to my absolutely messed up ankle. I shook my head back and forth. Cut to a few hours later, I was laid up in the hospital with a completely shattered ankle. I gave a statement to the cops and had even more of a cry when my mom came to visit. I went about informing all my coworkers that I wouldn't be seeing them for a few months. I got a small amount of closure when I heard the guy was arrested for petty theft. Apparently, he had a history of drug addiction and mental illness, and had committed a handful of opportunistic crimes over the last few years. As a result, this was his last strike, and he was going to be sent to jail for a few years, something I take great comfort in. I always remember the ride to my grandma's house when I was younger. We lived in a different state than she did, and the majority of the ride would be us driving on the interstate. When we got closer to the area that she lived in, we would get off onto the local roads. I always knew that we were almost to Grandma's house when we began going down the dirt road that led to it. I would always perk up and look out the windows to see all the sights there were to see on that road. There were lots of big trees that we recognized. There was also an old decaying shed that was right along the road, and sitting a bit back a ways was a really old decaying house out amongst the trees. It must have been abandoned for a very long time before, too, because not only was it in a visibly awful state, but if it had a driveway, it had long since been grown over by grass, bushes, and trees. I always asked my parents and my grandma about the house. However, none of them really knew anything about it. It had been abandoned long before even my grandma had bought the place. They also warned me to not even think about trying to go over there, though. They didn't even care if we hiked around on someone else's property. That wasn't their concern. However, they thought that old and abandoned house was likely to be very dangerous, and that's why they wanted to keep us away from it. Well, you know, children, when you tell them not to do something, that makes them really want to do it. Although for many years we did listen to our parents' advice and did not try to go and explore the old house. There came a time though when I was about 12 years old and I was the only kid who was at my grandma's house. I was pretty bored that none of my cousins were there, and I really hated listening to all the adults talking back then. So I told my parents I was going to go for a walk. It was a really lovely fall day, and those were the days I liked the most. Basically, all my mom told me to do was wear a jacket, and I did so. It was pretty cold outside, and the leaves were heavily falling from the trees. It was sort of desolate as well, since it wasn't an area in which many people lived, and thus there weren't people or cars on the road. It was a simple and peaceful fall walk. Now, I hadn't set out with any intention of going to check out that old house. It was just by chance that I chose to walk in that direction up the road, and not the other one. After walking for a while though, the house came into view, and I began to consider going and checking it out. I began making my way through all the trees to get to the house. I was a little bit nervous about someone driving by and seeing me. The last thing I wanted to do was get into trouble. If one of my aunts or uncles were driving to my grandma's house and saw me, it would have been a whole lot of fuss when my parents found out. I managed to get to the house without anyone catching me though. I nervously walked around the building. I considered stepping up on the porch, but it honestly looked like it might collapse if I tried to do that. I decided I would walk around to the back and see what was going on the other side. Unsurprisingly, it was even more overgrown back there. However, there were some windows I could look through that didn't involve me having to get onto the porch. I did have to get some weeds and tall grass flattened down though, in order for me to see through it. When I was finally able to get a good look into the window, I was not too surprised with how it looked inside. It seemed like I was looking into a bedroom. There was a metal frame for an old bed inside. It looked like there was a dresser as well. I was immediately curious as to what might be in it. I moved to where there was a back door to the old house. I was wondering if I would be able to get in through it. However, even though it was so old and decrepit, it was locked up tight and the door refused to budge. There was a small window in the door, so I was able to see into the kitchen of the house. There was a table and some appliances in there that were very, very old. As I continued looking though, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. I could have sworn I'd just seen something moving in one of the hallways. I shook my head in bewilderment, but even at 12 years old, I knew your eyes could play tricks on you. I didn't take it too seriously, and decided to get a better look through another window. I also reconsidered trying out the front porch to see if I was able to get into the house through that door. I had already forgotten the movement I thought I'd seen. I began walking toward one of the other windows, wanting to get a look into another one of the rooms. As I pulled up to it though, I almost fell over when I saw myself staring right into the eyes of one of the oldest and gnarliest looking people I'd ever seen before. The shock sent me back so far, I fell on my butt amongst the bushes. My hands landed on some thorny vines, and it cut me pretty bad. Suddenly, the back door opened. The really old and filthy man burst out of the house. His appearance was scary enough, but he was carrying a hatchet in his right hand as well. He appeared to be trying to talk to me, but I could only make out a few words of what he was uttering. "You stupid. Trying to break into my house? I'll cut you up good, boy." He lifted his hatchet up as though to strike. Fortunately for me, however, he was a very old man, and although scary, he could not move very fast. I was able to get up off the ground faster than he could reach me. It hurt badly getting up because I had the thorns stuck in my hands, but I didn't pay much attention to the pain. The man was close to me, and if I didn't book it as quickly as possible, I knew he was going to mess me up. I got up and ran away from him through the woods. My goal, however, was to try and get back to the dirt road. It would be easiest to run back to my grandma's house that way. Other than for a few moments, though, it didn't seem like the old man had the stamina to chase me. I was able to slow down once I got back to the road. Looking back at that house, I didn't see any sign of him at all. I was still scared about what happened enough to hurry my way back to Grandma's house, though. I didn't tell anyone what happened until years later. I was able to explain the cuts and stuff from just falling during a simple hike. However, I was more scared of the possible punishment I would get for being on that property. Years later, when I was an adult and finally told the story, no one really believed me. That was okay, I suppose, but the story absolutely happened, and I'll never forget the way that old man looked when he came after me. One of the worst things to ever happen to me happened a very long time ago, but I've always remembered it very clearly. I'll get this out of the way in the beginning. Not only did it happen out in the hills, it happened before everyone had a phone on them all the time, so I was not able to call for help when I needed it. One of my favorite things to do was drive over to my uncle's cabin out in the country and have a nice evening with him on Saturday. A lot of times, those visits would go really late into the night though, and then I would have to drive home through the dark country roads. I couldn't sleep in anyone's bed but my own, so I couldn't bring myself to spend the night over at his place. My uncle lived so far out in the hills that it took a good amount of time getting back to the main roads too. The night this happened was one of those nights. We had been up all night having some beers and stuff. Much more unthinkable now than it was back then, of course. We had been laughing and having a great time the entire way. The hour was getting late though, and everyone else was already heading off to bed. Even though I felt pretty tired myself, I decided to go out for a nighttime drive home. Yeah, as I mentioned above, I was probably somewhat impaired, which made driving during the night like that even more dangerous than it actually was. You have to realize just how absolutely dark it was outside. There were no lights along the dirt roads up in those hills. Plus, there were so many trees that even when the moon was out at night, it really didn't make much of a difference at all. The only light source at all came from the headlights of the small pickup truck I was driving, and it was so concentrated in front of me that it was hard to see from the sides at all. The roads were pretty dangerous as well. Extremely narrow, and didn't have enough room for cars going in opposite directions. No guardrails either. So there I was driving down that road, trying to drive as carefully as possible and slowly as I could do without running into any problems. I was putting all my focus into driving and making my way safely out of these hills so I could get some sleep. There were so many twists and turns in the road. All it would take was one deer to jump out in front of me in order to cause a really bad accident. I was paying attention, but I wasn't too worried about anything actually happening. At that time, I had never been in an accident before. I was sort of lost in my own thoughts when I rounded a corner on the hill. Once I did, two big redneck boys suddenly jumped out in front of my truck. I came upon them so suddenly that I couldn't control my reaction when I saw them. My hands on the steering wheel immediately swerved to the right to avoid hitting the two men, and when they did so, that caused my car to fly right off the road and off the side of the hill. I would love to tell you about what was happening at that point, but I seriously can't even recall what happened. I do know that I swerved after that, but I can't remember anything else. I can put together a rough image of what happened in my head though. I mean, obviously I swerved off the side of the road and the hill. My truck likely turned over several times when it was flopping down it, and when that happened, it knocked me out pretty good. Everything after is sort of a blur. Several times I came in and out of consciousness. I thought I heard and saw both of those redneck boys more than once. Knowing afterward how far my truck had fallen down that hill, they must have made a significant effort to try and get down there to where I was. I kept hearing them talking, but I wasn't able to make sense of what they were saying. At times, it seemed they were discussing whether or not they thought I was dead. I wanted to say something to let them know I wasn't, but I didn't seem to know how to do that in the moment. There was some talk as well about possibly burning my truck so there wouldn't be any evidence of what happened. That terrified me, but I couldn't do anything about it. I couldn't move or do anything to get their attention. I knew they opened the cab of the truck at some point. I found out later they had taken my wallet as well, since it's never been found. All I can figure is they must have figured out I was still alive, and that must have convinced them against burning my truck or anything like that. They also didn't do anything to help me though, which I know for a fact. I recall quite clearly waking up in the hospital the next morning. The reason I was brought there was because my uncle had stumbled across me in the morning many hours after I'd crashed. There had been no calls to the police or for an ambulance before that. I asked my uncle if the two men I had seen seemed familiar to him, but he had no idea who they might have been. As far as I know, he never found out either. Although I doubt they deliberately were in the way and caused the accident on purpose, they didn't do anything to help, and could have conceivably hurt or even killed me if they had burned my truck. This happened to me when I was only 14 years old. It was after my parents had begun working at home and were able to move out to the country. They had always said they had planned on moving out there if they could afford to do so. They had both been raised in rural areas, but had gone to college and stayed in the city after they graduated. Once they were able to afford it, there had always been plans to move out to the country though. I was an only child, so I didn't have brothers or sisters to keep me company. My parents also chose to move at the end of the school year, so I could finish up at school that year before moving. I'm happy the way they did it, but it also kept me from being able to make new friends at school before the summer break. It was also such an extremely rural area that there wasn't much of an opportunity to make friends anyway. A lot of that summer was just spent with me doing my own thing due to this. It was the first time in my life I didn't have any friends, so it was rather difficult for me to handle. It had also not been too long after I started getting more interested in girls. It didn't help that I would have so many thoughts about them but with no contact at all. I would often have these big romantic fantasies. I would go for walks after my parents went to sleep just to think. It was a way to lose myself in my thoughts, which was one of my favorite things at that time. The night that this story happened, I was on one of my regular late-night walks. I can't tell you exactly how long I had been out walking, lost deep in my thoughts, when I began to hear a strange noise outside. It was really hard to make out what exactly the noise was, but I could swear I could hear it coming from different areas. I wasn't scared in the moment, however. I was intrigued by whatever this strange noise could have been. As I kept walking and hearing these things, though, I started to piece together what was actually going on. I hadn't been out in the country very long and wasn't used to the weird sounds that were out there at night yet. I knew this too, so I continued doing my thing and walking along. All of a sudden, though, I heard a weird shrieking noise. Of course, as I heard this, I turned around instantly to look in that direction, and when I did, I saw the scariest thing I had ever seen in my life. There was a large, shadowy figure standing in the woods. That would have been frightening enough, but it almost looked like it had glowing red eyes as well. It seemed whatever this was looking right at me. I would like to think in retrospect I would have turned and run away, but I thought I was seeing something that not many people would ever see, and I wanted to take it all in even though I was terrified. A few seconds after I'd seen it, it seemed the red eyes disappeared, and then suddenly I could no longer see the shadowy figure either. It was at that point the fear finally hit me, and I turned and ran away, wanting to get back home after that weird experience. Throughout my life, I've experienced many unusual and often unpleasant situations. For privacy reasons, I don't want to give away too much information about myself, but I will say I'm a 21-year-old girl now living in Ireland, where I've lived over 5 years. I grew up in a small Eastern European country, of which about 40% are Russian, and I'm of Russian descent as well. Even though almost everyone in my country spoke fluent Russian and much of the population had Russian relatives, ethnic tensions within this country were very high. It was not uncommon for you to receive a lower salary, or worse treatment in shops and other public places if the place was run by natives. It's because of this I believe I was singled out as a target in this particular story. That and my feeble appearance as well, as I've always been quite short and skinny. My neighborhood, like any other in the area, consisted of many blocks of Soviet apartments, remnants of the USSR, rotting away but nevertheless housing hundreds of people. It was a good enough neighborhood, all things considered, and I would not have called my family particularly poor. The building we lived in, though, was rather bleak. The hallway was always dark and stank of piss or other bodily excretions. The building was quite tall and had this old creaky elevator, which smelled no better than the hallway itself, and often scared you into thinking it was about to break. This, however, was still more favorable than climbing the even darker sets of stairs, which often had people sleeping in them or groups of teenagers gathering to do drugs. The layout of the place is unimportant, but I believe the description of the shadiness will set the scene. After a year or two of living in this building with little occurrences aside from stumbling upon the occasional stoner with a knife trying to rob me for money, or a drunk passed out in front of my apartment, I started to notice these two native kids hanging around the neighborhood, a girl and a boy. At first, they never really spoke to me, and I paid little mind to them either. I would often notice as time went on them staring at me whenever I passed by, or gazing out from a distance as I played with the other neighborhood kids. These kids seemed weird to say the least. They spoke a limited amount of Russian and pretty much never interacted with anyone else. They would always just stand there watching me. Despite them being very similar looking, nobody knew if they were related or just two weirdos living in the building who'd stumbled upon each other. I remember always just assuming they must be brother and sister. After a while of this not-so-casual staring, they began to harass me on my walk home. They'd tease me, push me, just generally attempt to get on my nerves with what little Russian insults they knew. I had a pretty thick skin, so this didn't really bother me too much, though. I would either completely ignore them or fight back with what I thought were rather witty comebacks. These kids were absolutely relentless, though. Over time, I began to wonder why they decided to randomly pick on me so much. I had never said a single word to them before. I'd never played with them in any significant amount. I really didn't know them at all. I decided to settle for the "they must just be a bit weird" explanation. Nevertheless, this was all just teasing, right? Kids just being kids. One day on my walk home, though, the strange duo were on my heels as usual. The boy making some crude comments about my nationality and how I should go home back to Russia. Lots of other unrelated insults as well, while the girl also mocked me. I did my best to ignore their behavior, not feeling in the mood to dignify them with a clever comeback this time. It became increasingly difficult. It seemed in frustration the two had suddenly become much more aggressive than usual. All the other times this would go on, they just give up and leave me alone after a while. But this time, to my surprise, they followed me into my building and into that poorly lit, stinky hallway. Still ignoring them, I pressed the button for the elevator when I felt the boy roughly grab me from behind. I was in shock. The girl joined him, bending my arm at an incredibly uncomfortable position behind my back. "What the hell are you doing?" I screamed at them. They began attempting to drag me into the black staircase, telling me to shut the fuck up. I struggled, of course, not really understanding what had suddenly come into these two. I mean, I knew they were weird, but this was something else. This didn't feel like childhood bullies or kids just being kids. These two had something sinister on their minds. As I struggled against their duo grip, trying to break my way free and towards the elevator that had now arrived, a middle-aged woman walked into the hallway. A look of confusion was on her face as she asked, "Is anyone going up?" I desperately called out that I was, reaching for the elevator, only to hear the guy holding me snarl, "You're not going anywhere." To my surprise, despite the pure desperation in my voice and the fact I was fighting two seemingly older kids trying to drag me away, the woman didn't do anything. She didn't even ask what was going on, just shrugged her shoulders and walked into the elevator and closed the doors. What was going through her mind still makes me curious. I assume this was probably due to assuming this was nothing serious because of our age. Perhaps her not wanting to get involved any more than she already had in order to avoid trouble. After all, our neighborhood was not the safest. Best to stay out of things whenever you can. Luckily, her leaving became a surge of adrenaline, partially from my desire to get into that elevator and away from these two, and partially from anger at her refusing to do anything. It's amazing what the human body can do when faced with a dangerous situation. Using all of my strength, I whipped around and slammed the boy into the wall behind me, immediately making both of them let go of me. I could tell the two of them were as shocked as I was at what I had just done. As I said, I was a fairly small girl, but it felt as though someone else had possessed me in that moment. All I knew is I had to get away from this dark area. As soon as I was let go, I ran to the elevator and managed to get the doors open again and inside. The last thing I remember seeing is the doors slamming shut before we took off, the girl's shocked expression as she stared at me. The lady in the elevator didn't say a word to me, didn't even look at me. I wish I could say it ended there. A few days later, I was confident in my ability now to defend myself against those two, and was pretty sure they would not attempt to attack me again, or even go near me. That relief, however, was fairly short-lived. A friend of mine knocked on my door at the usual time I would go out on a free day, asking me to hang out. I, of course, excitedly agreed, and as soon as I was ready, we headed out and to the elevator. As mentioned previously, the elevator itself was not all that sturdy, and would easily break down. That's not the only thing that made it extremely unsafe, though. If you were a child and were taking the elevator alone, especially in a building as tall as ours where there were many, many floors, you never knew what the person who got on with you turned out to be, or what they could do to you, especially if the elevator suddenly got stuck. This wasn't something that happened often enough to prevent us from using it and instead take those dreaded stairs. We got on without a worry in the world and pressed the button for the ground floor. We began chatting about nothing in particular. About 4 floors down, though, the elevator stopped, letting on a burly middle-aged man. Just the sight of him was intimidating. He had this sunken-in face and long black greasy hair, sweat stains under his arms. His belly was so fat it took up most of the room in that tiny elevator, pushing my friend and I into a corner. We just kind of fell silent. At first, the man said nothing, just stared at the two of us as the elevator door slowly closed. I could tell that much like myself, my friend had an uneasy feeling about this man. In a deep, hoarse voice, he leaned in and said slowly and calmly, "Oh, you think you're so tough, don't you?" It was more of a statement than a question. I could tell it was directed at me. He pressed the elevator stop button, screeching it to a halt. He reached out and grabbed me by the fringe. He pinned me against the wall of the elevator, still holding on and beginning to pull me up. I could feel some strands of my hair ripping out of my skull as I was being lifted. However, not enough for my feet to lose contact with the ground. I squealed in pain, and my friend watched in shock, cowering into the corner, unable to do anything. "Well, I can be tough too." I began to try and make him let go of my hair to no avail. The more I moved, the more my fringe ripped out, and the more painful it became. Eventually, I stopped struggling and attempted to stand up on my tippy toes as much as I could. "You think it's funny to hurt my son, huh?" For a second, I had no idea what he was on about, but then I realized. The boy I had slammed against the wall in an attempt to get away. He must have told his parents what happened, most likely neglecting to include the fact he had attacked me first. Or maybe he had and his father just didn't give a shit. He seemed like a piece of crap himself. "I know what floor you live on. If you ever touch my son again, I'll bring a knife through your throat in this fucking elevator. You understand me?" Before I could respond, it began to move again. Someone must have called it onto another floor. He narrowed his eyes at me and let go of my hair, standing back and acting as if nothing had happened. We stopped and another person got on a few floors down. The rest of the ride was spent in silence. I don't know what was scarier, the fact this clearly insane man was threatening my life, and the fact his equally loopy son stalked me without my knowledge to find out what floor I lived on and what my routine was, just to get his psycho dad to threaten me. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.